Hello, how are you doing? I read a book for my in-person book club recently, which has been dubbed a modern classic, and which I was slightly intimidated about starting to read, but I just ended up really loving it. So I want to talk about why I'm so passionate about this book. It is Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, a biomythography by Audre Lorde. So Audre Lorde was a writer, an American writer of the mid-20th century. She was also a radical feminist, a professor, and a political rights activist. She defined herself as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. And so I'd heard of Audre Lorde before, but I just never read any of her work, and I was always interested in it. But I always had this slight feeling, I think, that maybe her writing would be a bit too theoretical heavy, or read like a political treatise, so might be a bit sort of dry. And I'm the way that this is defined as a biomythography, it sounds slightly technical, and so yeah, I think that's the thing which slightly intimidated about me to start reading her. But once I got into this book, nothing is further from the truth. I just connected with it so strongly. It's basically a coming of age tale which is heavily informed by Audre Lorde's own personal experience, her childhood, being raised in Harlem in New York City, and growing up in a family with a mother from the Caribbean who's quite light-skinned, but Audre Lorde herself was quite dark-skinned. And this term biomythography, I think that's a term she uses in order to draw from her own experience, in order to understand and define herself from the way that she's been categorized by her circumstances and the way that people view her. And I think really greatly written coming-of-age tales are always enthralling, because we can all relate to this experience, right? This awkward transition period between childhood and adulthood. But they also attune us to the particular challenges that some individuals face because of their circumstances and their identity. Audre Lorde gives her piercing observations about the world around her growing up in Harlem through to her early adulthood in the 1950s. So she charts her progress towards becoming proudly what she defines as Black, female, gay, and out of the closet. And this was obviously in a time when there was still widespread sexism, racism, and homophobia. I mean, there's still a lot of that to go around, but she captures this experience with such evocative detail and describes this process of becoming truly independent and defining herself in this independent way within the circles of family and friends and lovers and her community and the larger society and the country itself. It also really endearingly charts her progress towards becoming a great reader and a writer, which is obviously something that tugs on my heartstrings. The depths of loneliness and isolation that Lorde felt growing up in this environment is so powerfully conveyed, and I love how she describes this in almost celestial terms, where she writes, I grew up feeling like an only planet, or some isolated world in a hostile, or at best, unfriendly firmament. So this intense sense of alienation is so beautifully and poignantly conveyed, and the way that people look down upon her and judge her in various ways. And she continues writing, I could feel bands of tension sweeping across my body, back and forth like lunar winds across the moon's face. And so I love how she captures these sensations in her body of the emotions, of the emotional impact of growing up in this environment, but also the beautiful way she captures this in a metaphor here of describing herself like a planet, like this really great body, but within a huge empty universe and sky around her. I just think that's so beautiful. beautiful. In the early sections of the book, during her childhood, there is so much excellent imagery which is used to bring back to life this bygone era. So there are descriptions of her glasses, which she frequently breaks, and also a briefly known friend or acquaintance who has this big significance for when she looks back on her early life. But I think one of my favorite chapters is about this West Indian pestle and mortar in her family kitchen, and this object which is described as so beautiful and in such a loving way, and she fixes this almost like hypnotic intensity upon it, the way her mother used it to grind spices, and then when she sometimes used it. And so everyday objects like this take on almost a religious significance within the household, because they so powerfully tie her to this sense of family and culture and history. Lorde also cleverly differentiates her experience and understanding of the world as a child and how she saw it then from how she now views it and understands it, looking back upon it retrospectively. So there are some scenes from her childhood which she recalls, like when her mother would take her out in public and sometimes white people would spit upon her, and her mother explained this away, that these people were just being careless about where they spit. But when she looks back upon this, she knows that these white people were spitting upon her specifically because of the color of her skin. And she says that my mother and father believed that they could best protect their children from the realities of race in America and the fact of American racism by never giving them name, much less discussing their nature. So it was only through her experience and understanding the world when she became an adult to understand this sense of racism and her position as a black woman in America. I also really appreciated how there were detailed descriptions of her economic difficulties growing up when she left her house and trying to find a job and trying to find work, and how it was especially difficult for someone with her skin color and educational background. So she describes in very vivid detail these experiences of like working in a factory and the absolutely grueling conditions of that, and how there are really paltry safety measures in place, and the safety measures that were in place needed to be ignored in order to produce the quantity of work that was expected of her that would continue to allow her to do this job. So such dangerous circumstances. Although there was one aspect of this which I found slightly confusing, because she describes how she had this typewriter which she would write poetry on at home, and whenever she moved she would laboriously lug around this typewriter with her, but she says that she never really learned how to type, and I assume by that she means sort of type in a way that she could produce a certain number of words per minute or something, because she could obviously type, but when she went to find jobs, she specifically said she didn't know how to type, and so she wasn't put up for any office work like that, which might have been slightly easier than the kind of factory work. So yeah, I found that slightly confusing, but I assume that's just what she meant by it. It also felt especially meaningful that even when Lorde became an young adult and entered into some liberating spaces, there were still barriers in place which prevented her from finding true happiness. So she felt this really big drive to leave the country and wanted to move to Mexico, and she finally did so. And it's really wonderful how she describes the experience of living in this community around people who looked like her for the very first time in her life. And so she describes this as Wherever I went, there were brown faces of every hue meeting mine, and seeing my own color reflected upon the streets in such great numbers was an affirmation for me that was brand new and very exciting. I'd never felt visible before, nor had I known I lacked it. But she wasn't able to remain in Mexico for like work and visa reasons, so eventually had to return to the US, and there she started to explore much more freely a homosexual community in which she could feel more a part of. But then when she entered this, she gradually learned that there were systems of oppression in place, and there was racism within these lesbian circles, which wasn't sort of named. And she really pointedly describes how, as lesbians, we were all outsiders and all equal in our outsiderhood. It was wishful thinking based on little fact. The ways in which it was true languished in the shadow of those many ways in which it would always be false. So there's this sense that they're completely united, that they're all outsiders, and so they're all equal. But of course, they're not all equal, because Lorde was in the groups that she was a part of. She was one of the few Black people there, and so experienced this discrimination and oppression from within these own circles, and it almost couldn't be named, and a lot of the people she knew didn't want to discuss this or bring it up, because they didn't want to believe that as oppressed people that they could also be oppressors. And I think this is especially poignant because for a lot of gay people who grow up believing that there can never be any place to fully love anyone or enter into a romantic and a sexual relationship. And there are some sections of this which are really steamy and sexual when she gets into the detail and starts meeting a lot of people, which is wonderful to read about. But there's this sense that a lot of people have that once you finally obtain this, then everything will be okay. But this is kind of a myth. And so she describes this really poignantly in another line when she says, "We were like starving women who come to believe that food will cure all present pains as well as heal all the deficiency sores of long standing." But of course that's not true. And I think it's probably, everyone feels this on some degree if we're able to survive through our childhood and teenage years. Once we get to adulthood and find these relationships which we have chosen for ourselves, they're not always as fulfilling as we expect them to be, and they don't automatically solve all of our problems. There's also a really interesting stylistic choice she makes in how she wrote this book, in that interspersed with the larger linear narrative about her growth from childhood through to adulthood, we get these short italicized sections every once in a while. And early on, these take the forms more of kind of poems, but then later on they become much more kind of narrative based, these italicized sections in how she's articulating and understanding her experience. And I think this is such a clever way of showing her growth as a writer and an artist throughout her life, and as a critical thinker of how she grew to understand the world progressively through this period of time and this very significant period of growth and development. And it shows how her intellectual understanding of the world was evolving alongside while all these other things to do in her life were happening, to do with family and work and lovers. But throughout all of this, she declares, "Writing was the only thing that made me feel like I was alive." It feels like such a gift that Audre Lorde documented her experiences and her thoughts in this way for future generations. I mean, I was really surprised by a lot of the content of this. It felt really forward-thinking for a writer who was working in the mid 20th century. It's such a wonderful book, and I'm so glad that it's been designated by Penguin as a modern classic. And I also love on the back of this book there's a blurb from Jackie Kay who says, "I came across Audre Lorde's Zami and I cried to think how lucky I was to have found her. She was an inspiration," and I think she's served that for so many people. And if you don't know Jackie Kay's work, I'd really recommend reading her as well. Her novel Trumpet, as well as her memoir Red Dust Road, and she's also written many great collections of short stories. But yeah, overall, reading this book was such an enriching and wondrous experience. I really enjoyed it, and I'm so looking forward to reading more of Audre Lorde's work. So yeah, if you've read this book as well, please let me know about any of your thoughts or feelings or reactions in the comments below. I would love to hear about them. Or if there's other books by Audre Lorde that you would recommend I'd read. I know there's a number of different nonfiction books, as well as books of poetry, and yeah, she produced quite a lot and was such an influential figure. So yeah, really excited to read more of her work. But thank you for watching me talk about this book. I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.